Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to our distinguished guests, our colleagues, and members of the press. My name is Spencer Cradian, and it is my honor as Senior Bureau Official for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration to welcome you to this important event, the Global Refugee and Asylum System. What went wrong and how to fix it. Migration has emerged as one of the defining challenges of our time. And the global refugee and asylum system is at the heart of this issue. The asylum system in many countries is facing increased strain, undermined by misuse from economic migrants and others who bypass immigration laws. This abuse risks its credibility and effectiveness during true humanitarian crises. Privately and publicly, many political leaders identify the problem, but establishing a better system will require more than just words. When the 1951 Refugee Convention and 1967 Protocol were established, it was a very different world. World War II had just ended. International travel was relatively rare, and the Cold War was underway. We face a broad array of much more complex challenges today. Reforming the international protection regime requires a return to core principles: sovereignty, border control, temporary asylum status, and the obligation of countries to expeditiously accept the return of their nationals. This event is not just a conversation, but it's a call to action. We aim to galvanize support for changes to the international refugee and asylum system. Over the coming months, the United States will convene interested nations to develop and formalize new principles that reflect today's realities. We hope this event will serve as a precursor to broader collaboration where nations can work together to address the impacts of migration, develop regional solutions, and ensure that asylum remains a tool only for genuine humanitarian protection. I'm confident that the discussions we will have today are going to help shift the discourse on this critical topic and lay the groundwork for meaningful reform. Before we proceed, I would like to take a moment to introduce the distinguished panelists who will be sharing their insights and expertise with us today. President of the Republic of Kosovo, Dr. Vjosa Usmani. President Usmani's leadership has been instrumental in advancing Kosovo's international partnerships and fostering regional stability. We have Dr. Khalil Rahman, National Security Advisor of Bangladesh. Dr. Rahman's insights into regional and global security dynamics have been pivotal in shaping Bangladesh's role as a key contributor to peace and stability in South Asia and beyond. We have Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carlos Hoyos from Panama. Vice Minister Hoyos' work underscores Panama's role as a bridge between continents and a leader in multilateral engagement. We are expecting also Minister for Foreign Affairs of Liberia, Sarah Basilo Nyanti. And
right on target.
There we go.
Look at that. You're just being announced.
How are you? Minister Nyanti is a dedicated public servant committed to fostering global partnerships and addressing pressing global challenges. Each of these leaders brings a wealth of experience and a unique perspective to today's discussion. Their contributions to global diplomacy and their commitment to addressing the challenges of our time, including migration, are truly inspiring. And now it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker and the host of today's event, Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau. Deputy Secretary Landau has been a steadfast advocate for reforming the global refugee and asylum system, and his leadership in this effort is invaluable. He brings a wealth of experience, including as former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, and a clear vision for how we can address these challenges together. Please join me in welcoming our Deputy Secretary to deliver the keynote remarks and guide us through these discussions.
Thank you, Spencer. Is this working? Yeah. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this event. I have to say, I think this is a very important topic. Migration, I think, is going to be one of the defining topics of the 21st century, whether we like it or not. It was in some ways a defining topic of the 20th century as well. There were massive population shifts in the 20th century, and the United Nations actually played a role in that, usually in creating international mechanisms to assist migratory flows, to help nations create asylum and refugee systems. I mean, let's not forget, this organization arose from the ashes of World War II. And one of the lessons of World War II is that countries felt that they had dropped the ball in not giving protection to people who were stranded in Nazi Germany and in the Axis powers and who were persecuted. So many countries around the world, including my own country, the United States, established a legal framework in the late 1940s, around the same time this organization was created, to create a refugee or an asylum program under our domestic law. We also, of course, have a completely separate and quite complicated, reticulated system of immigration laws. So I think one of the points that I wanted to start with is that we're talking really about two distinct issues that often get conflated. One is immigration. Each sovereign country can set its own procedures for immigration, and immigrants can be welcomed for many reasons: economic, you might want to improve a technology sector, you might need labor in your country. That really varies country to country. Asylum status was always meant to be a much smaller subset of that. And I can speak to our domestic law. Again, every country was going to have its own domestic laws. And I should say, by the way, we haven't coordinated this on this panel, so we might have different views on this. And so I am speaking here for the United States, for myself, and I think one of the great things here is that we have a chance to have a conversation to talk about these things. But in our law, in order to qualify for refugee status or asylum status, you need to have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of certain enumerated statutory characteristics that, in a sense, responded to the problem we saw in World War II. The basis of religion, race, political opinion, but it was not generally meant to be something to supplant the migration laws, right? Economic privation is not a basis for asylum. That might be a basis for migration, but this was meant to be, in a sense, a separate asterisk to the asylum laws, that basically when there's some people who are really at such risk, imminent risk of harm on the basis of these narrow defined protected categories, we will allow them into our country outside the scope of our migration laws, kind of as any port in a storm, right? That if they were not allowed immediately to get out of their country, they faced almost certain injury or death, right? And so we have those laws. Again, that is a very noble concept, and I think the UN promoted international standards for refugees, has continued to do that. So I think the UN has been instrumental in setting up these kinds of refugee or asylum systems all around the world, and in facilitating migration to some extent. I think now, in the year 2025, we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, we take a step back and we see that there are massive migratory flows taking place. And a lot of times, massive amounts of people are claiming asylum. In our system, at least, when these claims get adjudicated, 90+% of people are found not to be eligible for asylum. And we all know this kind of abuse is happening, frankly. And people who are economic migrants are coming in our country saying that they are, that they should be given asylum. Our problem is when you have hundreds of thousands of people who arrive all at once and claim this, that really requires an individualized adjudication. So now we are, in a sense, saying, okay, well, please, you take a number, and we will be back for your individualized interview in 6 years. And in the meantime, people can live in our country legally. They can start. They might get married. They can work. And so, in a sense, the migration, the asylum system has become a huge loophole in our migration laws. And we just have to be realistic about this, right? And I think the UN has a responsibility, just as it was instrumental, I think, in encouraging countries to adopt these kind of laws. I think we have to be realistic that these laws are now being abused, and we have to just, acknowledge that. I think the first step in dealing with any pathology is to acknowledge you have a problem. I think this is, again, not just a United States problem. We're seeing this all over the world. That is not to say, frankly, that there are not real asylum seekers. But I think, frankly, if you have hundreds of thousands of fake asylum seekers, what happens to the real asylum seekers? They get lost in the midst of a massive bureaucratic process. So I think it behooves those who really are concerned about the plight of the real asylum seekers in the world to have an international order that accepts the fact that we should discourage people from abusing this process, and saying that the process is susceptible to abuse is not being xenophobic. It is not being a mean or bad person. It is just saying this is not the purpose for which this limited exception was created. And I think, I hope very much, the United States hopes that this is part of the international agenda, or else basically the asylum system will serve as a mechanism to make mass illegal migration legal. And that won't last for long. What you're going to see is countries saying, okay, we're not going to have an asylum system at all. So for those of us who believe that asylum can play, as it was initially intended, a valuable role, I think this should be a top international priority to recognize the need to revisit the asylum system in the 21st century. I think in our view, there are 5 critical principles that the United States would like to put on the table that we see as kind of the basis of hopefully an emerging consensus. First, that every nation ultimately has the right to control its own borders. That's what it means to be a sovereign nation, to say we get to decide who comes in and under what circumstances and for how long they get to come in. That is the quintessential element of sovereignty. Second, there is no right to immigrate or to receive asylum or refugee status in the country of an individual's choice. I mean, sometimes we see people who leave one country and traverse maybe a dozen countries to get to another country, right? And that defies the image of any port, any safe harbor in a storm, right? I mean, that makes it look like this is no longer, trying to avoid imminent injury or death, and it makes it look like it's just a substitute for migration. Hey, I want to go to live in this country, and so again, I think that is not the basis of asylum. Again, is to give someone shelter from immediate injury or death on the basis of certain kinds of characteristics, not again to just facilitate mass migration. Third, refugee status is temporary, not permanent. We should reject the presumption that recognition of being a refugee is just another form of migration. Again, if the idea is it's any port in a storm, then when the storm is over, the presumption should be, okay, we've given you the shelter in a storm, but now the understanding is you should go back to your country. Again, for us, these are kind of common sense principles, and I think are valuable to prevent the people who are asylum seekers from being subject to abuse and, frankly, from abusing the system. I was meeting the other day with an ambassador in Washington. We were talking about some of the abuse of the asylum system, and he was laughing, and he told me, he was in an Uber the other day, and there was a guy from his country there driving the Uber. He says, "What are you doing here?" And the guy says, "Oh, I have asylum here." And this guy, meanwhile, had actually flown back to his country to visit his family. And, this is a country from which he sought asylum. Frankly, I didn't even know that was possible, to return to the country from which you're seeking asylum, go on a holiday, and then come back to the United States. But we just have to be realistic. Like, these things are happening. And especially, I know there's those of you in this room who are big believers in an asylum system. But if you want to have an asylum system, please do not feel that you need to defend the abuses of the system. Please try to find common ground among all of us on ways that the asylum system can actually fulfill the purpose for which it is meant to serve and does not become a fig leaf, in a sense, for just ordinary economic migration. I will just wrap up now, but I think it's important, again, to emphasize that ultimately sovereign states and not transnational bodies must be making the determination whether the conditions in a country of origin permit return. And finally, every country, and this is, I think, just a basic of international law, must agree to accept expeditiously the return of its nationals. So in concluding, let me just say, I read an article the other day that Greece enacted a new law. Again, this is an issue all over the world. It's not just in our country. That said, asylum seekers whose claim is rejected in the, judicial system of Greece or whatever special asylum system they have to return within 14 days. And then I saw statements condemning that as illegal. And I thought, well, what was the purpose of having an asylum hearing if the person loses and says you're not entitled to rejection? Of course the person should have to go home. I mean, if the person's allowed to stay in Greece, even if they're as an asylum seeker, even if their asylum claim is rejected, then was the whole thing just a farce? I mean, we have to have certain understandings that, yes, you come because you are presumably, you have a well-founded fear of persecution you on these grounds. You explain what it is. There's a prompt adjudication, and then you abide by the results of that adjudication. But really, I'm very grateful to our co-panelists for being in this forum to discuss their perspectives on migration and asylum, which I think are going to vary among all of us. But really, I think as the beginning of a serious international conversation that I think we have to recognize that the asylum system around the world has been subject to abuse if, in fact, we want to save the asylum system itself. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, and thank you to my esteemed colleagues on the panel. I want to turn first to Kosovo's President Usmani. Many European nations have long been committed to this global protection and asylum system. However, in recent years, Europe has faced unprecedented challenges, including large-scale migration. So how have the commitments of nations in Europe to that system affected the country's ability to respond to mass migration, both by land and by sea in Europe?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Thank you, everyone, for having me today in discussing this extremely important topic, not just for Europe, but for the rest of the world. Given what the Deputy Secretary said, let me perhaps begin by saying I was a refugee. I was a refugee, like two-thirds of the people of Kosovo, forced to flee our country because of a genocide that was being committed against us. And because I was a refugee, because we felt the helping hand and the open hearts of nations around the world during our hour of need, I believe I can say that today, we're in 2025, the conclusion from the experience that Europe has is that the asylum and migration systems that are being applicable today were designed for a completely another era and are absolutely not ready for today's tidal wave of movement across land and sea. And secondly, because I was a refugee and because I felt like all the people of Kosovo, the helping hand of nations big and small, led by the United States, by the way, in supporting us during our darkest hour, I can say today that the biggest harm to true refugees is the abuse of this system. The abuse of this system by criminal organizations, practically, by criminal gangs around the world who have been using the loopholes of the system to make millions for themselves at the harm of civilians, at the harm of ordinary citizens, and at the harm of true refugees and those who need the protection of the global protection system. Now, I do agree it must be our democratic right to decide who enters our countries and who enters our borders. Therefore, we need new, swifter, and more agile legal frameworks. just recently within the European system of cooperation, I co-led a discussion on migration, and we had a lot of European leaders that have been facing the burden of the loopholes of the system firsthand, including the Prime Minister of Italy and many others. And what we all came to the conclusion is that it is the illegal migration that must be challenged in order to protect and preserve the integrity of those who are real asylum seekers, of those who are legal migrants, of those who respect the rules and who respect the law. Because I strongly believe that freedom is not open borders and no rules. Freedom is with rules. It comes with law, and it comes with enforcement. What we have seen, however, is criminals, traffickers, and sometimes even hostile states. Look at the example of Poland, for example, and what Poland has faced because of Russia and Belarus. Hostile states sometimes, and with the help of criminal gangs, are using migration as a weapon. The conclusion of that working group that day, also given the experience of Italy, was that these criminal gangs need to be fought the same way that we fight the mafia. The same way that we fight the mafia, with intelligence, with law enforcement, and most importantly, with unity. Sometimes it also requires the principle of follow the money, because these criminal groups have a lot of money, amounts that they've created through illegal means, and always by harming innocent people, and always by harming those in true need of the protection of this global protection system. What happens is we have a broken system and overwhelmed nations. Nations are faced to carry the costs, while criminals and opportunists are exploiting the loopholes. What should be quite a shared global responsibility is falling squarely on some individual countries. That is, of course, then leading to resources drained, societies destabilized, and citizens, societies at whole, then feeling unprotected because of these loopholes in this system. Once again, to repeat, genuine refugees and asylum seekers deserve protection. They deserve protection, but that protection will only be possible if the system is used for them. Currently, it's being used against them. Everyone's being put in the same sack. Criminals who are abusing the system and those who truly need the protection of this system. We're proud in Kosovo to have been cooperating with European nations in fighting the criminalization and the abuse of the system. However, what we've identified alongside other European nations is that we not only need to start the conversation, we need to get going about changing the rules in a way that would protect those in need and would make each and every one of us individually, but also as a collective, stronger in fighting the criminal gangs who are abusing the system. We're very proud to have been the only, so far, the first country in Europe, so far we're still the only one, to have signed a third country national agreement with the United States to support President Trump's agenda in fighting illegal migration, because we're ready to give back and support countries that need the support of Kosovo. Despite being a small country, we try to punch above our weight, and we try to be there for countries who are facing similar challenges. At the same time, because we've seen how the United States is facing a lot of these problems because of these criminal gangs, cartels sometimes, we became the very first country to align our terrorist organizations list with that of the United States, including the last 3 executive orders of President Trump. So if someone is deemed a cartel organization and a terrorist organization because it is endangering the security and national sovereignty of the United States, they're also considered terrorists in the Republic of Kosovo. And I think this kind of cooperation, where we understand where each country is hurting and we try to be of help, but we always with the ultimate goal of making sure that the system is being used to protect those in need, not to ultimately remove the protections, but to protect those in need, while at the same time being effective in fighting organized crime, because ultimately the abuse of the system is happening through organized crime, is what we need to do. So again, to conclude, new rules, swifter and more agile legal framework, people-centered framework. After all, we're all the leaders of individual countries, and we need to meet the needs of our citizens. We need to make sure that they feel safe and secure first. And at the same time, these new rules must be such that they are uncompromising against criminal networks. We should not allow the cooperation between those networks to be stronger than the cooperation between our countries. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, President Usmani. I would like to hear next from National Security Advisor Rahman from Bangladesh. During the War for Independence, large numbers of Bangladeshis sought temporary asylum. But today, you are very generously hosting over 1 million refugees at significant cost. How does Bangladesh view the Refugee Convention and the idea that refugees should not remain forever in the country where they are now?
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Landau, distinguished moderator, and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, you bring me back memories of my own life 50 years ago. We suffered a terrible genocidal attacks on our population, which pushed 10 million people across the border into India. Fortunately, the situation didn't last very long. In less than a year, war ended, and we all came back home. Okay. And now fast forward 50 years, and we are on ourselves housing 1.2 million refugees. And I have my good friend, the High Commissioner for Refugees here, and he saw them many, many times in camps in Cox's Bazar. Now, these Rohingyas fled what the US called a textbook case of genocide. Now, in the last 8 years, the world spent upwards of $5 billion on them, US being the largest donor, and thank you for that. And we, ourselves, spent probably way more, and in many more ways, more than money, okay? Now, how much did we all spend on Rohingyas before they came to Bangladesh? Nothing. Their lands are bountiful. Their waters are plentiful. We used to buy food from them. They don't need us. We need them. So all this money that we spend, including US taxpayers' money, which I mentioned to you in June when I visited you, it's completely unnecessary. Now, today, of course, we cannot send them back against their will. But what is their will? High Commissioner, you saw when you go to the camps that they want to go back. The Secretary General who came, UN Secretary General who came to Bangladesh on a Ramadan evening, broke fast with them with 100,000 refugees. It was almost like a biblical scene. Everybody had a placard in his hand, a sign saying, "We want to go back home." Of course, we cannot push them back against their will, but should we keep them against their will? They want to go back. So, you see, I see more efforts in getting financial resources for them, which is extremely important. Don't get me wrong. As long as they're here, they have to be fed, They have to be taken care of. But I see far fewer attempts to resolve the issue. So it has become, it's ridiculous that we keep spending our taxpayers' money. We are not mobilizing enough political resources to resolve this issue. So in the meanwhile, what happens? Kids grow in camps. Every year you have 30,000 new kids that are born there. And they grow up without any hope, without any light end of the tunnel. And what do you expect them to do? President Usman, you came back because the world was together in resolving your problem. You're lucky.
Yes, we are.
But, think about Rohingyas. They're no less human than you or me. Can we make them lucky by making the right kind of political investment? Now, I'll give you some good news. The place where they came from is called Rakhine State of Myanmar. And 85% to 90% territory has been taken over by Arakan army. And we are in frequent touch with them. Last week, they sent me pictures where Arakan army head was talking to Rohingyas who have been brought in from the internal displacement camps back to their villages. The village headman is being chosen from among them. They built some new mosques. They opened a grand mosque in one of the major towns. So things are getting better. This is the time when you actually make the political move. So I would urge everybody to make sure that in the next few months, we come together and pledge to ourselves and to the refugees that we make this political investment. Next week, we have this UN International Conference on Rohingyas. Many of our countries will be represented there. This is what the Rohingyas are waiting to hear, that the world has finally heard us and they want to do something about us. They want us, they will help us go back to our homes. So this is, therefore I will make this call. Many of these Rohingyas have received asylum in different countries. Last month, we organized a conference in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, which is the largest refugee camp in the world. And these people came one after the other. They expressed their desire to go home, including people who are in diaspora. We're talking about asylum of refugees in Western countries, United States included. These people want to go home. Please help them go home. So I don't want any money to be spent on the Rohingyas in the 3 to 4 years from now. Rather, spend a little money, a fraction of it, in Myanmar so that they can restart their lives, get their future back. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rachman. Next, I want to turn to Liberia. Foreign Minister Nyanti, your country has a long experience of tackling the issue of migration. What suggestions do you have for reform of the asylum regime from Liberia's own experience?
So thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you, Deputy Secretary of State, and of course, the other platform guests, other panelists. So I will share two different perspectives. I don't speak in terms of a position of the Liberian government, but I speak from the perspective of someone who has led humanitarian operations around the world, being former humanitarian coordinator in South Sudan and assistant humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, and managing the largest humanitarian operations in several countries, and being the primary person responsible for protection of civilians. And so I have that vantage point, as well as being from a continent, not only just Liberia, but from a continent that actually has a huge number of migrants and refugees. Something that not everybody realizes, that on the continent of Africa, 54 countries, between countries, you have a huge population movement and people seeking refuge in the neighboring countries. Liberia being a country that had decades of instability and had a crisis, civil crisis, and thanks to all of the countries that supported us through that difficult period, and have seen us through this other side, where we're now managing peace and successive democratic elections. But who are refugees in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and those countries had to take us in. And those countries also have population movements. And of course, when we talk about this only from the perspective of people moving from Africa, for example, to the US or to Europe. But we do have an intercontinental challenge as well. The points that were raised from Deputy Secretary of State, the 5 points, and on reflection of those 5 points, my thought firstly would be sovereignty, yes, but sovereignty does not negate shared responsibility because it's a global issue. There's a global crisis. And we must respect the sovereignty of every nation. Every nation has the right to determine how they would like to manage migration and manage the issue of asylum seekers and so forth. But we need to also distinguish between asylum and economic migration. And I like the point you raised in terms of how it gets confused by many people, Deputy Secretary of State. Many people think that they're interchangeable words and so forth, and think that the systems that are required for all of them should be the same, which it should not be. And we should have very clear laws and rules of engagement that we all agree to, fully agree to that. The asylum system should not be abused for labor migration. And oftentimes, people are seeking asylum because they're looking for labor mobility. And in that quest for labor mobility, then abuse that system and think that it's okay to do that because that's an avenue, a pathway. So how do we then create, in a spirit of partnership and emphasizing sovereignty and responsibility and solidarity, how do we create a system where labor mobility is more available and it's more structured and it's based on shared principles, agreed parameters and so forth, and separate that from asylum seekers. The humanitarian obligation is another part of it, which the issue of non-refoulement, the issue of non-refoulement is not returning people to countries where they're persecuted for religion or race and so forth. And as Deputy Secretary mentioned that as well. But no single country or region should have a disproportionate burden as we discuss this issue. And I think a better understanding of what the situation is globally contextualizes the conversation in a way where we see it from the lens of everyone else. And sometimes when we're looking at it, we look at it only from our perspective. And fair enough, you're responsible for your country, you look at it from your perspective. But this is where shared responsibility comes in, where we discuss how do we do this together? How do we work together? And how do we make sure that we can find solutions that work for all? One point I would make as a recommendation is for us to look at labor mobility. Look at programs for labor mobility in a way where you have short-term opportunities that are structured, that are limited, that provide jobs and skills that go back to help to build those countries that are fragile, that are in need. And I think these are the discussions we need to have in terms of how we move. And Deputy Secretary of State would tell you that when we met, I told him, I said, Liberia, we started economic diplomacy in 2024 before the U.S. started commercial diplomacy. And we had some jokes about that, and I was saying to him, thank President Trump for following Liberia's lead.
She was first, okay?
But this is because we know that aid does not develop countries. And I just want to throw that in there as well. The more we work on private sector and creating jobs for young people and making sure that young people have the skills and so forth, they won't want to leave. They won't want to go to other countries if they can find prosperity at home. And I think when we look at it from that perspective and look at solutions, this is one of the things we need to look at.
Well, thank you, Foreign Minister. And then I now want to turn to Vice Foreign Minister Hoyos from Panama. Panama has faced significant pressure from mass and illegal migration through the Darien jungle, primarily heading towards the United States. What can other countries learn from your experience with this mass migration?
Thank you, and thank you, Deputy Secretary, for organizing this conversation, and to my fellow panelists. The Darien Gap is a beautiful rainforest that you do not want to cross for asylum seeking. Unfortunately, it was a route that was created through sheer necessity, and our location, and I guess decision to never open up the Darien Gap, which is the only place in the Americas where the Inter-American Highway is cut off for about 60 miles. The devastation of nature, and worst of all, obviously, seeing the human suffering of the almost 35,000 souls that were going, God bless you,
Thank you.
Deputy Secretary, that were going through Panama in those conditions was devastating. The human cost is undescribable for a region that has a history of asylum seeking, and even in Latin America, we even have 3 conventions for diplomatic asylum, which is quite special. And it's also a system that is overwhelmed and abused. I think that has been said here by all 4 panelists, that the system is outdated and it lends itself to abuse and to an overwhelming of the host countries when there is this mass movements, as was the case of Panama. For us, it would have been impossible to solve without the assistance of the United States. That is a reality. We had all of the political will. President Mulino, even in his campaign, was talking about this all the time. This was the first time, at least in our history, that such a humanitarian crisis had really unfolded before our own eyes. And he said that he would close the Darien Gap. And through our collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense, State, we've been able to coordinate not only the security measures to the extent that we have been able, fortunately, to return a lot of the immigrants to their countries where it was possible. We have hundreds of, thankfully for us, a very small country, Panama, we have hundreds of refugees that came back, so north to south, that we are still hosting because of the impossibility of sending them back. And this has been, cover of New York Times, it's been in world news. And for us, we don't want to take any route that puts in jeopardy a person's life. And at least for the last 40 years or 35 years plus, Panama has been a little bit like the hedge of Latin America, right? So wherever there is a political crisis, you start getting more citizens of that country into Panama. And it also has effects internally, right? They are looking for jobs, they are looking for a better life, and we want to support while also maintaining control of how they come into the country and even when they go out of the country. Obviously, the strong stance that was taken by the U.S. government to stop immigration really sent an international message of just don't do it. That helped us a lot. And if not for the cooperation with Colombia, which was key in our coordinating efforts with Venezuela, a big majority of the immigrants were from Venezuela, and we don't have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So Colombia was instrumental in assisting us in returning these citizens to their countries. We are committed to keeping our spot, at least in the region, as a place of conversation and security. Now, because of our very fragile governmental, I would say, structures in our capacity to have the proper response to a big immigration crisis, I think reiterates the importance of the multilateral world in order to coordinate responses to these crises. But someone has to step up. That is the reality. If no one is willing to front the bill, or if no one is willing to contribute some space, as is the case in Bangladesh, as a national security advisor was saying, the problems will keep arising. And it's very difficult to expect small countries to be able to deal with these massive challenges. So we also need to focus on fixing the issues in these countries, make sure that any political turmoil doesn't spill over into violence, which in Latin America has been the case, but a lot less than other regions that have a bigger need for international assistance and cooperation. And also the willingness to participate in the system, as the Minister of Liberia was mentioning, is also a key part, right? We are all willing members of the multilateral system, and if there are things of the system that unjustly burden members, I think it's very valid to express those concerns and to address them up front so that we can get some answers. So, again, this is an issue that we are committed to contributing. In our region, spoke about Venezuela, but the biggest problem now we have, I see some Dominican brothers here is in Haiti. We are very committed to solving the issue in Haiti. I was just speaking about it with the Deputy Secretary. And you can count on us to assist in this matter while we are still in the UN Security Council and in further. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Vice Foreign Minister Hoyos, and thank you all for your participation and for a great discussion. We look forward to working with you in the months to come on reform. We understand there are probably lots of questions on the topic. We want to make this a conversation, and so with that, we would now like to open the floor to some questions from the audience, and maybe we'll have multiple questions, and then the panelists would have the opportunity to answer those questions. I know
How are we doing time-wise in terms of...
we have 5 minutes.
We will give very quick answers then. Yes.
Quick answers. So I know High Commissioner Grandi, Foreign Minister Ciarto had questions, and the EU, I believe, had a question as well. Go ahead, Mr. Foreign Minister.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Super happy and grateful to be here. I just want to tell you that Hungary has a very specific situation here, since we are located at the entrance of the European continent when it comes to the busiest land route of migration to Europe. 2015, 10 years ago, we have been run over by 400,000 illegal migrants when we made the strategic decision to protect our border. We built a fence, which is not a wall, but we are a smaller and poorer country, so it's a fence. Where we have 24/7 surveillance. And for the last 10 years, we have been able to stop 1 million illegal migrants at our border. It's a bit of a crazy situation that currently we have to pay €1 million penalty to the European Commission per day for not allowing the migrants to come in. But we do follow three principles. First, we have the sovereign right to decide whom we allow to enter the territory of the country and with whom we are ready to live together. Second, violation of a border between two peaceful countries is a crime. It's not a human right, and that must be addressed in a proper way. I want to underline border between two peaceful countries. Violating it is a crime. And third, that international law must be called upon here. International law speaks very clearly. If someone is forced to leave his or her home, he or she is entitled to stay on the territory of the first safe country, but not on the second, third, fourth. So therefore, we Hungarians, who are neighbors of Ukraine, we have let 1.3 million refugees from Ukraine to come in because we are the first safe country. But we have stopped 1 million illegal migrants at our southern border because they are definitely not refugees. Those are illegal migrants, because if you cross a dozen or at least half a dozen of safe countries, by definition, you cannot be a refugee. So I just want to underline that we build a fence, we protect the border, we don't allow illegal migrants, and we pay €1 million penalty on a day. Thank you.
Thank you. High Commissioner Grandi.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I had a question, but I have a few comments, if you allow me, Deputy Secretary. First of all, to say that it was extremely interesting to listen to all of you. I actually share most of the points that have been made. I think they are also belonging to slightly different context. You have context like you described very well, Deputy Secretary, of people move, or the President of Kosovo, people move. Investment that Ambassador Rahman spoke about is extremely important. The final point I want to make is that my belief is that, and I haven't heard anything from the panelists different from this, that the fundamental principles governing asylum, genuine asylum, are valid, continue to remain valid. It's how we implement it that needs to be constantly evolving. And this has evolved. Even in my own career, this has constantly evolved. You know, we have been working very much, for example, on accelerated asylum procedures that some of you mentioned, on how to improve the return to their countries of people that are not Yeah, you mentioned this as one objective of this process. Very important one. We work with IOM on that, for example. And we are also developing, we discussed it the other day, concepts on safe third countries, something that all of you are looking at. With proper safeguards, this can be done. So my conclusion is, please, consider us an interlocutor and a partner, both in mass refugee situations and in more complex mixed situations that you're all facing, because we want with you to find solutions to preserve asylum, genuine asylum, and to protect the people who flee for genuine reason, persecution, or violence. Thank you.
Thank you for those words and actually for that constructive tone. You know, I think for us in the United States, I think President Trump alluded to this in his speech. I mean, part of this is our domestic legislation. We have to address this and clarify things. As the Foreign Minister of Hungary was saying, you know, we can impose additional limitations on our own rights to asylum, that, you know, you can't cross numerous safe countries in order to reach our country and then claim asylum. That's the kind of thing I think is a subject of domestic legislation. But, you know, I think we have perceived that there is a whole network of NGOs and multilateral institutions that are really promoting people to be migrating, to be, you know, giving them a script that if you say this, then you'll be entitled to an asylum hearing. I hope we can, and again, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm saying I thought your tone is exactly what we want. Please, we just want to be able to work with the international system to prevent these systems from being abused. As you just recognized, you said the same thing. Nobody is saying that the underlying right. I mean, you know, and there are refugees in the world. You know, I mean, you know, on this panel we have several, and you know, in my family as well. And so, you know, again, but in order to preserve what the system was meant for, we can't be tolerating a system where 90+% of the cases are bogus, and then the real ones wind up being the needle in the haystack. I think you agree on that. We agree on that. So let's, again, I hope this conversation is maybe the beginning of a recognition that you know, reform is really necessary to save the very valuable goals. So again, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Well, it's not my job. That's the moderator's job.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists and
our audience and our moderator.
Thank you to everybody for coming. We hope this event will be a starting point for a new era of collaboration on these issues. Thank you very much. Do please stay seated for a minute while the panelists depart.
Oh, you're going to be here now. Okay, good.